Now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Dr. Robert Minetti. Dr. Minetti is the president and owner of Minetti CPA LLC. He's a CPA, CFE, CVA, MAFF, CGMA, CFF, CRFA, and is a licensed private investigator in the state of Arizona. Dr. Minetti, we'll turn the time over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. So let's review our objectives for today's class. Once you complete this class, you're going to be able to identify the procedures and requirements for conducting fraud investigations and specifically looking at the issues related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, if we're going to talk about fraud, and if you've ever been in any of my fraud courses, you know you're not going to get away without a slide on Dr. Donald Cressey's fraud triangle. Now, Dr. Cressey was actually a student of Dr. Edward Sutherland's, who was one of the first people in the United States to study fraud. Dr. Sutherland actually coined the term white-collar crime to differentiate what he called crimes of trust, like fraud, from crimes of violence, like battery, murder, etc. Now, Dr. Cressey wanted to find out why people commit fraud. So he actually went into the prisons and interviewed hundreds of convicted fraudsters to find out why did they do it. Well, the first reason they did it was pressure, or what Dr. Cressey referred to as an unshareable financial need, a need for funds they couldn't come up with through their ordinary access to resources, their paycheck, their savings, etc. In today's world with COVID-19, there's a lot of pressure. 50 million people lost their jobs. So there were a lot of families were affected, not just the people, but their spouses, their significant others, their children, their parents. There was a lot of pressure out there in the world today. We've had a lot of issues where people are running short on cash. We've seen long lines at food kitchens and food banks, because people don't have the money to pay for food. We've had to do eviction moratoriums because people can't pay their rent. There's a lot of pressure out there that we need to look at. Now, rationalization is what people do to explain to themselves why something is okay. I know I shouldn't do it, but I'm going to do it anyway. We all rationalize our behavior. I do it. The most common time I rationalize what my behavior is when it comes to dessert. Oh, I'm going to eat that piece of apple pie because that's a serving of fruit, and I'm supposed to have 5 servings of fruits and vegetables every day. Well, I know that they don't really mean apple pie should be your serving of fruit. I think they want a fresh apple, but you rationalize your behavior and you eat dessert anyway. Now, opportunity is the third part of the fraud triangle, and that's where we give people access to our funds, to our accounts, to our businesses. We give them our personal information so they can commit identity theft, access our credit cards, access our bank accounts. So these are things that we need to consider when we're looking at fraud and also trying to prevent fraud. Because if we can stop the fraud from happening, well, we're better off. We don't have to investigate it because investigations are a long process and they're a costly process for the victims. Now, when we talk about fraud, we want to look at the basic legal elements of fraud. First of all, there has to be some act. You have to do something. You have to steal something. Thinking about a crime, planning a crime, whether it's the most elaborate fraud or Ponzi scheme ever devised, if you don't actually do it, it's not a criminal offense. Then we look at concealment because the fact that they're concealing the crime helps to prove the intent. Because most of the time when people are get caught with fraud, what's the first excuse they have? It was a mistake. It was an error. Well, we don't hide errors. When we find a mistake, if you make a mistake and find it, you fix it. You don't hide it. The fact that they hide it is what we can use to show intent. And conversion, where they converted what they stole into something they could spend or use. And conversion, sometimes you may even have to convert cash by laundering the money so that you can place it in use. So these are the basic elements of fraud that have to be there. Now, when we talk about fraud, we can look at the occupational frauds. and you're probably already familiar with these: financial statement fraud, or cooking the books; asset misappropriation, sticky fingers, the old 5-finger discount; or corruption, misusing your position with your employer for your own personal gain. Now, obviously, asset misappropriations are the most common type of fraud, followed by corruption and financial statement fraud. But financial statement fraud is the most expensive to companies, usually because owners or senior managers are involved. And the average cost, according to the ACFE, is around $1 million per fraud when you're talking about cooking the books. Now, we also have non-occupational frauds, medical insurance fraud, unemployment fraud, which is huge right now. As a matter of fact, I got caught up in that. I got a debit card from a bank in Pennsylvania, and it had $6,800 in it. And I called the bank and I said, "What's this for? Why would you send me a prepaid debit card with $6,800 on it?" And they said, "Well, that's for your Pennsylvania unemployment." And I said, "What Pennsylvania unemployment? I'm not employed. I don't live in Pennsylvania. I've never lived in Pennsylvania as an adult. I've never worked in Pennsylvania. Why in the world would I get unemployment?" So we started to do research, found out that my personal information had been compromised with the Equifax data breach, and criminals had used that to try to get money from the state by filing a false unemployment claim, claiming I was unemployed living in Pennsylvania and I needed money. So I had them cancel the card. I contacted the state of Pennsylvania and told them that this was fraud, that I didn't want that. And if you do get these, don't just let it go. You do need to file the fraud report and make sure everybody knows, because if the claimants get away with it, if you don't catch it, and they, in this case, they sent the card to my home address, which was good. Had they sent it to the address that the fraudsters had put in there, I may never have known about it until I got the statement at the end of the year for the uninsurance, and that I needed to pay taxes on it, because most people don't realize unemployment insurance is taxable. And so when that fraud occurs, it's not a harmless fraud, because now you got to deal with the IRS explaining why you never got those unemployment benefits. We've also seen workers' compensation fraud going up. People claiming they got the virus at work or from a coworker. That's been one of the issues that we've seen. There's also issues with product liability fraud, advertising fraud, identity theft. We're all familiar with credit card frauds. You've either had or know someone who's experienced credit card fraud, various internet frauds, employment frauds. And those things don't go away simply because there's a virus out there. As a matter of fact, many of them are being exploited. One of the things we've seen, and I've got 2 articles here for you to look at if you want. One's from CNN, the other one's from Fox. I make sure I cover both ends of the spectrum so that we don't bring politics into any of these training courses. But basically, what are we talking about? Criminals are taking advantage of the coronavirus, in order to go out there and commit fraud. They're trying to expand their network of committing fraud, how they're able to commit frauds, how they're able to con you into it. And in just a moment, after we do our first polling question, I'll show you some of the things that they're doing. But we do have to do these polling questions in order to meet NASBA guidelines. So our first polling question: fraudsters are taking advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic to increase cyber fraud scams. True or false? I just want to give you just a moment to answer that. And of course, the answer is true. Now, some of the specific frauds that are tied to COVID-19 that we might be investigating. One is testing scams, where they're selling fake testing kits or at-home testing kits. Some of these things, just breathe in here and it'll tell you whether or not you have the virus. I don't believe we have anything that sophisticated yet. The really good ones, they still have to stick a swab halfway down your nostrils to make sure that that's whether or not you have the virus, so that they can do that. Now, what we're looking at is proving, and intent is pretty easy to prove here. Yeah, the test was fake. You knew it was fake, or you should have known it was fake. The hard part when we're dealing with this is finding the individuals who are selling these fake tests. And usually, especially when they're doing it online, many of these individuals are located outside the United States. So it becomes very difficult to locate them. Another fraud we've been seeing since the COVID-19 started was insurance frauds. Now here we have fraudsters, they're actually contacting individuals, telling them that their company insurance policy doesn't cover COVID-19 because it wasn't discovered until after the policy went into effect. So apparently new viruses are not covered by insurance, according to fraudsters. And they're claiming that, telling people your current coverage doesn't cover COVID-19. So we need you to buy a COVID-19 supplement or a rider or a separate COVID-19 insurance policy. And of course, what do they want? Your name, your address, your social security number, your date of birth, lots of personal information. And then of course, people are paying them for these policies, which are basically worthless. There's no real health insurance companies out there selling COVID-19 only coverage. It's covered in your normal health insurance. Also, the government has appropriated literally billions of dollars to cover COVID-19 testing for people who don't have insurance coverage. So for the most part, those tests should either be covered by your current health insurance or they're going to be covered by the government. So when people pay money for these scams, we need to investigate. And once again, the hardest part is finding the individuals who are doing it, especially when they're hiding on the internet or selling it through the internet or through phone calls. We're not going to have any pictures of them. We don't know what they look like. There's no opportunity to do facial recognition. And many times the names that they're using are false, or they're giving fake names in order to sell the items. Now, just like any other disaster, we're seeing charity scams. People saying, hey, we can get help with the COVID-19. We're almost at a point where we can have a cure. We need a few more dollars. Wouldn't you like to save the world from COVID-19 with your donation? Well, guess what? People fall for that and they send their donations. Now, those charity scams in today's world aren't limited to COVID-19. We're seeing charity scams for victims of civil unrest. Oh, businesses are being burned and ransacked. Wouldn't you like to donate to help those victims of that civil unrest? Gee, we had a hurricane in Louisiana and Texas. Wouldn't you like to be able to take advantage of helping these people and go ahead and make sure that those people get some money? We have fires in California. And of course, the question is, what happens to all the people in Oregon, Arizona, California, Washington that are being burned out because of these wildfires in the Western United States? Wouldn't you like to donate to help them? A lot of these charities are scams. Now, if you're donating to well-known charities that you've done business with for years, you're probably okay. But many individuals are being victimized, and many times they're giving their credit cards, and not only do they run the credit card for the donation, but if there's any balance on the credit card left after that, they run more charges on the card in order to try to wipe the victims out for as much as they can. Another fraud we've seen tied to the COVID-19 virus is quarantine scams. And this is where they're calling, asking for money because a relative, a friend, somebody else has gone through quarantine. They can't get home. They need airfare, hotel money, bus fare. They're not able to work. They're not able to go to work. They have to spend time at home. So we're looking at these situations and trying to find out, what is out there. So we're trying to make sure we get the information. And the fraudsters are pretty good, because where are they finding the information? They're getting it from social media. They have information on your relatives, your friends, your coworkers, other people. That information is easy for them to obtain. so they don't have to dig very far for it. Another fraud we've been seeing a lot of is frauds having to do with the 2 weeks of paid vacation employees can get because of the coronavirus stimulus packages. And in this case, the FBI is warning companies of employees faking coronavirus, claiming that they had the virus or that they've been advised to stay quarantined in order to take 2 weeks off with pay. Now, of course, since the government is subsidizing, these particular sick days, they're the ones that are investigating it. If you're stealing from the government, whether it's, and we're seeing issues with fraud in the PPP loans, the payment protection loans, the EIDL loans, with the sick leave, with other government benefits tied to the stimulus package, we're still seeing large amounts of fraud in those areas. So these are things that we're setting to investigate. Now, we're also seeing prevention scams. We can help you prevent you from getting coronavirus. My favorite is the coronavirus fan, that you put it in your window and it blows all the viruses out your window. Serious? Who falls for that? Yeah, we do have people who have. Oh, that makes sense. The fan can detect the virus in the room and it'll blow it outside so I can't get infected in my house. For $29.95, you can get a coronavirus fan. It's totally worthless because the fan can't tell the difference with air with virus in it and air without virus in it. But they're selling fake prevention scams, including drugs, online supplements, herbal medicines, and fans that will protect you from the virus. None of these items have been approved by the FDA to say that they will do any good at all. So these are usually pretty easy to say, yeah, they had intent because these items were useless and we knew they were useless. Once again, part of the hard part is finding the individuals to make sure we know who we can go after. We've also seen people selling fake treatments, using fake cures, and that we can help you and cure it or prevent it. And sometimes what they're doing, in this case, hiring or using well-known people or semi-well-known people, politicians, celebrities, actors, actresses, sports figures, to sell their fake items. In this case, the FBI arrested Keith Middlebrook, who's an actor, for peddling bogus coronavirus cures, stuff that didn't work. So we know these issues are out there, things that we need to be aware of and we need to look out for. Another one we're seeing is people selling fake supplies, masks that don't work. And, the CNN reported a case where they had, 39 million N95 masks that really were useless. They wouldn't stop anything. They were just, very light pieces of paper. So we've seen them selling fake masks, respirators, face shields, gloves, hair nets, hand sanitizer, toilet paper, other things that were high demand. The stores are rationing these items, so they're selling them on the internet. They may or may not be delivered. They may or may not be the quality that you need. They may or may not be able to prevent you from getting the virus. These are things that we need to take a look at. Now, another one that's kind of fun, and it's the fact that there's a app scam out there. Now, this one's kind of interesting because what they're selling is an app that says, we can tell you where the virus is. We're tracking the virus. Seriously, how do you put a GPS device on a virus? I don't think we have any GPS devices small enough to put on a virus. So that's something that we're not able to do. Now, what happens is they're saying, well, we can track individuals who have the virus because that's all reported. Yes, it's reported to the CDC and the state health department, but they're not allowed to go out and tell everybody who has the virus and who doesn't. Don't forget the HIPAA laws are still in place. You have a right to privacy on your personal medical information, and so does everybody else. And the last one that I loved was the sniffer app, that it could sniff out the virus. So if you're going into a building and somebody in there has the virus, it'll sound an alert on your cell phone to tell you there's virus in the building so you can stay out. Okay, yeah, no, that's not real either. It's a fake, but it's amazing when people are scared. And let's be honest, there are a lot of people who are scared right now. Millions and millions of people are hunkering down in their homes. They won't leave their house. Their groceries are being delivered. They're working from home. I know people who haven't left their house since March. They haven't gone outside. They won't take a walk in the park. They won't do anything. And when they're scared, they're more likely to fall for these cons. They're also more likely to be on the internet and become susceptible to these cons. Now, we also want to remember, don't forget the good old-fashioned phishing scams. Phishing, vishing, and smishing. These are also taking place, so that we need to be aware of these. And they're sending out emails that look like they're coming from the World Health Organization, the CDC, the FDA, hospitals, state health agencies, trying to gather information about you. And, we all understand how phishing emails work. At some point in your life, you or somebody you know has received an email from a Nigerian prince who wants to put $3 million in your bank account. Hopefully, you've never given said Nigerian prince any of your money because, that's when they go ahead and wipe out your bank account. We've also seen a number of provider scams. In this case, the scammers are contacting people by phone or text messages or emails. They're pretending to be doctors or hospitals that treated a friend or a relative or a coworker from COVID-19, but they didn't have enough money to cover the treatment. They couldn't cover their copay, deductible, etc. Would you be willing to help? Sometimes they even set up GoFundMe accounts or other types of open accounts where people can donate to these causes. And it's not just for the sick. They also are trying to say people are dying, and they're going for the funeral and cremation scams. Somebody has passed away. There's not enough money to bury them. In order to have them buried in a mass grave somewhere, would you like to help them get buried with dignity? That's exactly what the email says. Would you like your relative to be buried with dignity? Well, who's going to say no to that? And in some cases, they've actually been collecting money for people who aren't dead. Yes, they're still alive and they're going to bury them or cremate them. Either way, that's a bad idea. We don't do that to living people. So that should trigger right away. Oops, we got an issue here. First thing you do when someone calls you for money for a burial, call your relative and make sure that they have actually deceased and they're not still alive. Because we've had many cases of this reported where people sent the money and then found out, oh, wait a minute, they're still living. How are they going to bury them? So we've got these criminals. They're just looking to take advantage of the situation. They're going to try to tug on your emotions. They want you to act emotionally rather than logically. Obviously, we've seen a number of investment scams. Fraudsters are doing pump and dumps. They're selling investments. These companies are coming out with cures. Don't you want to be in on the ground floor? They're going to make millions of dollars once they roll out the vaccine, cure, etc. You can get in on the ground floor of these stocks by buying now. Well, we all know how these pump and dumps and fake investment scams work. They're nothing more than Ponzi scams or pyramid schemes, and most of them are going to crash eventually because they're going to run out of money because they're spending all the money themselves. We saw a huge number of bailout scams where people were contacted by fraudsters pretending to be from the Treasury Department. We need to verify your bank account information and Social Security information for you to get your $1,200 stimulus check. Those stimulus checks were a big chance for criminals to come in and say, hey, we're going to steal your money. And in some cases, here's one that the FBI from San Diego put up, the one on the right, where Costco sent out, oh, gee, here's a $100 bounty from Costco. Yeah, Costco had to limit the number of people going in their store. They had lines around the building. You waited an hour and a half to get to go into the store, and they were going to give you $100 because they wanted more shoppers. Really? Not happening. One key thing, if you look on there, you'll see that kind of mini URL, the shortened URL. The criminals use that to hide the real URL that you're going to. So anytime you see something in an email or a text message that has one of those mini links to it, pretty much figure it's fraud, and it probably is. Now, another one they're going after is the business loan scams. We've seen them filing loans for PPP loans and EIDL loans for businesses. You know, even though they weren't the owners of the businesses, they were filing those loans, trying to get that information. You know, we trying to get government stimulus funds. We've seen people file for businesses that didn't exist. You know, people taking their stimulus money. In one case, somebody used it to buy a car. Another case, they used it to pay off their past due child support, buy jewelry and other items. One case used it to take a fancy vacation. None of these were items that were allowable under the EIDL or PPP program. But the criminals are out there committing the frauds. Excuse me. And so we need to be aware of that. And these are some of the things we're going to be asked to investigate. So let's go ahead and take a moment and jump into our second polling question. Fraudsters take advantages of individuals and businesses, true or false? I'll give you just a moment to answer that. And of course, the answer is true. I'll go ahead and leave that up for a little bit so that everybody has a chance to answer. Now, we look at some of the fraud examiner rules. You know, we can be working for a client pre-litigation, which means, you know, before the litigation starts or during the litigation period. We can be working for a client as an employee before litigation or after the litigation is commenced. We can work directly for an attorney. We can work as a special master for the courts, which means we're appointed by the court to do the work. Obviously, law enforcement officers have a significant role in looking for white-collar crime. And of course, we could be working on legal holds for potential litigation or regulatory investigations for various companies or individuals and how they acted or things that they did. Now, when we look at this, we need to understand, you know, making sure that if you're a consulting expert, you can technically be covered under attorney work product. So you're working directly for the attorney usually, and the client's going to pay you, but the attorney supervises your work. And some or all of that work could be excluded from discovery. If you're a testifying expert and you're going to testify, obviously all of your investigative work is discoverable. And if you're working as a special master for the court, again, everything you have is discoverable. Now, when you go to accept an engagement, things you want to consider, a conflicts check, both the litigants and the attorneys. Do you have any conflicts of interest? Don't forget to look at conflicts with suspects or witnesses. Obviously, if it turns out you have a relationship with the suspect, that's going to really mar your testimony or your fraud investigation. Do a skills assessment review. Do you have the background and knowledge to conduct this type of fraud examination, Or do you need to bring in help? Do you need to bring in a mentor, somebody to help you out? Make sure you determine the scope of the engagement and keep it as narrow as possible. Remember, when you're under cross-examination, if it ends up in court, they're always going to ask you, why didn't you do this? And the best answer you can have for why you didn't do something is, it was outside the scope of my engagement. I was not paid to do that. Always add that last part. I wasn't paid to do it, because the jury doesn't understand scope of the engagement. Most jurors think scope is old mouthwash. I wasn't paid to do something. Every juror understands that. You don't pay me, I don't work. Real simple. Make sure you have an engagement letter. I know that all the major professional associations say you can have a verbal agreement, but when you're dealing with criminals, you're dealing with a fraud examination, you may end up in court, and if you end up in court and people are litigating, you want to have a written engagement letter as a best practice. Another best practice is getting a retainer up front, because if it turns out you didn't find any fraud, it was just an error, you can't prove it, nothing's going to be recoverable, some clients don't want to pay you at that point. So always make sure you look into that. You also want to make sure, do you need a PI license? For doing certain types of investigations, you might need a PI license depending on the state you're in. You may have noticed when they did my bio that it mentioned that I had a PI license in the state of Arizona for certain types of investigations, fraud investigations that I do. Yes, I've had to use that. So every state is different. So make sure you look at the licensing requirements of your state before you launch into doing a fraud investigation. Now, when we're planning the investigation, once again, the first thing we need to do is determine the scope. What's the scope of the investigation? Create your search outline. Who are you going to talk to? Who are the potential subjects? Who are your witnesses? Who are you going to want to interview? How are you going to capture information that you find online in social media, emails, etc.? How are you going to document the information that you find? If you look at web addresses, make sure you notate the date and time, who found the information, and screen print everything, because things change. People post stuff on social media, they take it down. They post stuff on websites and they take it down. Make sure you remember the client's budget. Don't go blowing out the budget, going down the rabbit hole, because clients don't like paying for that. Another thing we have to plan in our investigation in today's world is social distancing and infection risk. Is it safe to go into the client's location? Sometimes when we've been searching for individuals, I'll give you an example. When we're trying to find people who have skipped out on child support, we may go into bars where their coworkers or friends work, talking about them to try to gather information. Many places, those bars are now closed, or if you go into them, you need to be very careful. So what do we have to consider with where we go to conduct the investigation? How safe do I have to be? What personal protective gear should you be wearing, not just to protect yourself, but to protect your clients and their employees, to make sure that we have that covered. When we start the investigation, what are we looking for? That evidence of fraud. And remember, red flags don't always mean there's fraud. Sometimes they're just errors. It does happen. We're looking for the stolen assets. Can we find the assets? Many times I've gone in when we're dealing with inventory or fixed asset frauds, and we find that employees are selling the items on eBay or Craigslist or somewhere on the internet. If we're dealing with stolen data, credit card information, social security numbers, employee information, customer information, are we looking for information on suspects? Are we trying to find hidden assets? What did they do with the stuff after they sold it? We may need to go back and look up information on corporations, charities, not-for-profits, LLCs, trusts. We're looking for associates of the suspect, people we can talk to try to gather information. We're looking at lifestyle information. Are they spending more than they can really afford to spend? Are they living some extravagant lifestyle on a tight budget? Now, when we talk about interviewing suspects, I'm bringing this up because it's really changed the way we do business. Normally would use the basic interviewing methods, the Reed methods predominantly used in North America. The Peace method came out of Great Britain. The psychologists talk about motivational interviewing. Of course, we don't do physically coerced confessions anymore. There's no more shining lights and rubber hoses. But when you're doing interviews today, you have to consider social distancing, infection risk. Somebody's going to be wearing a mask. Those facial expressions that we've been taught to observe, yeah, how do you see those through a mask? Body language is going to change. And this is something most people haven't thought about. The simple fact that if you're in a room alone with a suspect, that social distancing, the risk factor for the virus, that's going to change how they react in the interview. It could give you false positives that the person's trying to mislead you because they're nervous, they're upset, they're apprehensive, and you're going to pick up on that. You need to be aware of that. Also, the fact many times in today's world, we're now recording conversations. Why? Because we're doing them over the internet, with Zoom or GoToMeeting or other things. Or if we're doing them individually, we're video recording the conversations because we don't have that third person in the room who used to be there, where we'd have an extra person in the room to take notes and write things down. Why? Because of virus fears, and the fact that the people are going to be nervous. Now, if you do have a conversation or a phone call, under federal law, as long as one party to the conversation consents, it's okay to record the call, and that includes doing an audio or video recording. Some states require for audio recordings that you have two-party consent, and I've given you a list of those states here so you know which ones that you have to do with. If you do need consent, make sure you get it in writing. Now, we also do surveillance, and that can be putting up cameras in the client's location, following suspects. People who are claiming to have on-the-job injuries, we follow them and take pictures of them doing things that the injury wouldn't allow them to do, like playing football, golfing, etc. When they have such back pain, they can't show up to work. Doing other types of electronic surveillance, but make sure you know the law in your state where we're allowed to make audio and video recordings. Now, for the most part, video recordings without sound are usually legal, unless there's an expectation of privacy. No taking videos in changing rooms, restrooms, etc. We all know those rules. Now, obtaining evidence, still we're predominantly looking at consent. If the client gives us the information, obviously we can use it. Using subpoenas, or for law enforcement warrants. Doing depositions, though we're still finding people who are leery of doing depositions, and that's a great excuse for someone to put off, I don't want to get the virus, I'm not willing to leave my house, I'll only do a deposition if I can do it via video, which makes it harder to watch their body language or gain their reaction or look at what they may be looking at as far as notes or other things that they have in front of them during the deposition, because it's off screen. It's not in front of the camera. Using interrogatories, looking for things in the public domain, including social media. We've already talked about the changes we've done in conducting interviews, including the use of videotaping interviews. And of course, the Freedom of Information Act requests have pretty much stayed the same. We can still file those with the federal government and the state trying to get government information. Now, we also do a lot of times searching public records, driving records, criminal records, real estate, bankruptcy, court records, the internet, company filings, social media. There's a lot of information. Most of that hasn't changed because we're still doing it online. So COVID-19 hasn't really changed public records, unless you're dealing with small communities that haven't gone online yet. And there are some of those, but they're still pretty rare. Now, I do remind you, where some items you have to have consent. If we're doing the research, credit reports, medical records, tax records, academic records, clue reports, all of those require the consent of the person that we're doing the search on. So you can't just jump out there and order these reports without making sure that you get their consent. And again, if you are going to get consent, get it in writing. It's not required. Consent is consent. Technically, written consent is not required, but it's highly recommended. Why? Suspects forget verbal conversations, especially after they talk to their attorney. I didn't understand. I wasn't really giving consent. You confused me. That isn't what I intended to say. You misunderstood the intent of what I told you. I wasn't giving you consent. I was just saying, acknowledging, yes, that I understood you wanted to look at the stuff. I never actually gave you permission to look at it. That written consent can allow us to include that information in our investigation, turn it over to law enforcement if we're going for a criminal investigation, present it in court, to make sure that the information is out there. Now, there are certain items that we simply can't do. Trespassing, going onto somebody's property. Well, that would be even more dangerous now with COVID-19. He's quarantined and staying home. You don't want to be sneaking into their property. Wiretapping, tampering with mail is one I've seen get some investigators in trouble, which is why I bring it up, because they see it on the TV shows. Magnum PI walks up to somebody's house, sorts through their mail, opens an envelope and finds a clue. You just committed a felony, but they don't put that on TV, so they don't talk about those felonies when we're on TV, but we need to be aware of that. Hacking, I get a lot of things. Well, couldn't you, they hacked us. Can't you hack them back? Can I? Yes. Is it legal? Absolutely not. Two wrongs don't make a right, and two legal activities don't keep you out of jail. The fact that somebody stole from you doesn't mean you can steal from them. Even stealing your own stuff back can be problematic. Obviously, bribing the information, not only the fact that bribery would, of course, mean the information is very unreliable. And you can't impersonate a law enforcement officer. That's a thing that people have gotten in trouble for, pretending to be, I'm with the IRS, or letting people assume you're with some type of government agency. So let's go ahead and do a third polling question. Hacking, trespassing, and bribery are okay as long as you have a PI license. True or false? And obviously, those are all illegal activities, so the answer is false. Now, when we're gathering evidence, we have to look at both direct and circumstantial evidence. Many times in a fraud examination, we're going to prove our case with circumstantial evidence. Wow, $20,000 went missing from the company bank account. The suspect had $20,000 electronically transferred into their bank account, which they took out in cash and went and spent. Well, we may not be able to directly trace, because it may have gone through multiple accounts. It didn't go directly from the company account to the employee's account. If it did, that's direct evidence. That's real easy. But it went from 5 or 10 different accounts and banks and eventually ended up in the company's account. Or we don't have the evidence that the money went into their bank account, but the money went missing from the company and suddenly the employee buys a new car. Those are circumstantial evidence. Now, when we look at the different types of evidence, we look at documentary evidence, which is paper evidence or electronic evidence, things stored on a computer. Physical evidence, actual cell phones, disk drives, fingerprints, other information. Testimonial evidence from suspects and witnesses. And our personal observation as investigators. We can testify on that as well. When you're documenting the evidence, make sure you include a case or reference number, Bates number, location where the evidence was collected, who collected it, the name, the date and time, a description of the evidence. You want to make sure that you don't alter the evidence, that you have it properly documented. Put paper documents in clear sheet protectors and seal them. Use evidence bags for your physical evidence like disk drives, cell phones, etc. Make sure all of your evidence is secure. Any electronic data should be password protected. You want to encrypt the files that you send over the internet and store your backups in a separate location. Make sure you have a good inventory of your evidence so you know where it is. Make sure you have a chain of custody. That chain of custody is there to make sure you can show, who had care, custody, and control of the evidence from the time that you took it into your custody until you turn it over to the court or present it to law enforcement. That chain of custody, especially in a criminal case, can be very important. We need to be able to document that in writing. Everybody who touches the evidence signs for it. And we need to make sure that we preserve the evidence, that we try to do verification from multiple sources, that we have backup copies, because we have had cases where criminals have come in, and what have they tried to do? They've tried to, steal the information back, take back the evidence, try to hold on to that evidence. We want to make sure if you have sensitive information, credit card numbers, social security numbers, birth dates, other personal information, that is encrypted. Remember, once you have that information, you're responsible for securing that information. State and federal laws require you to keep that information confidential. You can't just throw it out on your server and hope everything works out okay. Remember the rules for discovery, and the federal rules for evidence. Don't delete stuff. If you gathered it, you got to hold on to it. The worst thing you can do is go through and start deleting files, because when you get hit on cross-examination, they're going to assume that everything you deleted would have, helped the defendant. And in that case, it's going to look bad. Why didn't you keep this information? The jury's going to wonder that as well. So they're going to look at that and they're going to say, well, gee, we don't understand why you didn't hold on to that information. What were the issues? So we want to make sure we do that. Because eventually, anytime you're doing a fraud examination, whether it's in the pandemic or after the pandemic is gone, we're still going to have to remember that we may have to show up in court and testify. And we want to do our final polling question. Physical evidence includes electronic devices, fingerprints, and photos. True or false? Now, because of the shortness of time, we weren't able to take questions during the presentation. So you can feel free to send me any questions via email, or you can also send me those questions by hooking up with me on LinkedIn. I always accept LinkedIn requests from anybody who attended one of my webinars. Just notate that you were in the webinar and you'd like to link up, and then feel free to ask me any questions. And you can also send the questions directly to the NACBA, and they will forward them to me, and I'll get back to you. Now, for questions, I'm just going to let you know, most of the questions, because of the volume we're expecting, and we've got a number of presentations coming between now and the weekend, most of your answers will probably get back to you on Monday, just so you know that. So I want to make sure everybody's had a chance to, answer all the polling questions. And if you have anything you want to ask me, feel free to let me know.
And just so everybody knows, there's only 3 questions. So that last one you can disregard. There is no 4th question.
Thank you, Colin. I appreciate that. I threw that 4th one in there. I always like the final one, but let's just make sure everybody gets credit today.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing. Guys, I want to thank everybody for attending the webinar today. We got another great one going on tomorrow talking about economic damages from the COVID virus, if you're interested in that. Otherwise, I hope to see you in one of our webinars in the future. Have a great day.